You're having a good fall.
Well, this last book that I just had
Oh.
come out, which is called Fat Formania, is on Billboard's top list, and I made the
wow.
fourth top 10 with my book Fat Formania. So yeah,
Yeah, that's a good fall.
very good fall. So hi, so we have a small group, but a good group here to talk about this stuff. And hi to the people being recorded. Your
Thank
teacher
you
loves
so
to do
much.
that. Okay, so I don't quite know how to, what you'd like me to speak to, what issues you'd like me to speak to, but I can give you just a brief, maybe, explanation about who I am and why I'm here, what my career kind of has been. So, just in general, like what I brought today is artwork, and I brought the book that goes with this artwork, and I'll explain that in a little bit. Soldier's Heart. So, I was raised in the Chicago area. My dad here was came from a family of people who helped build the city. In other words, they were bricklayers and pipe fitters. And he never saw his work because it was always buried underground. Because a pipe fitter, the way he did it, they would bring in water in these big water mains, and he would fit these giant pipes that would then come out, and they'd build a building, and then it would go up from there. Often his work was buried or hidden. Very hard work. My mom came from Tennessee. She went to a very progressive school there in the little mountain town where she lived. Believe it or not, when you think of Tennessee now, it was different back then. It was mostly farmers. But she was very well educated. And then when World War II came, my dad was from the Chicago area. My mom was from Tennessee, and all the people who joined the military went to Tennessee to train. There was a big army base there. My mom was top of her class and was the ace at typing and everything else. So she was hired as head of personnel, and she was quite the person in charge. So I had an executive type mother, and my dad was a pipe fitter. They both were great, funny, always had a lot of fun, a lot of integrity with their work. But by the time I came around in the 50s, they were sort of distant. You know, they were overwhelmed with the business they had, and everybody was kind of like, like this. So I grew up around busy parents who had I didn't know how I fit in. I had an older brother and an older sister, and I didn't quite know how I fit in because they were, I was the runt. I was the little one. Back then, there was no expectation for women to do anything with your lives. So the expectation, if there was any, was that maybe I'd marry some guy and have kids. But there was no sense of like college or, starting a career. That was just kind of not it. The women stayed home, the men went out to work, and kids like me, the third kid, a girl, my sister was going to go to the convent. She was sort of like holy. And my brother was going to be an athlete, and he went off, and he ended up being in the Olympics and stuff.
Wow.
And so when it came to me, they'd go down the list, oh, she's artistic, but whatever. And then they'd go on, from there with their descriptions. So I never got any, really, I never got any of this. It was just like, oh, Carol, artists, artists. Weird. And if I had said, Mom, that's it, I just want to drop out of school and marry, this guy over here and just have a bunch of kids and that would have been cool with that. They weren't going to send me to college. My dad said he just couldn't see putting me to college. Well, I was in art school like this, and this was my favorite class. And I noticed that I had a couple of skills. One was that because I was kind of told to sit down and shut up most of my life, I was pretty good at doing that. Just kind of listening and observing and out of the way. And when you're not the focus of attention, like I was not the focus of attention growing up, with no expectation, that just completely opened up my world in a funny kind of way. Because I didn't owe anybody anything. All I had to do was listen and watch, and kind of pay attention, and I watched the whole drama of what was going on with my family and everybody, and it was just terrific. And they were funny and fun. But I also understood that I could also sense this undercurrent, because I felt marginalized. I didn't know what was going on. I thought that in order to really excel, I need to become something, that then they'll see who I am and they'll pay attention to me. Maybe I'll get their attention that way. As time went on, I started to realize that these people were seriously flawed. So it turned out that their first kid died in very tragic circumstances, right after my dad came back from big bad World War II. And so my dad then, turns out, over a lifetime, I figured out he had PTSD from World War II. And guess what? Guys of that generation were not allowed to have that. It wasn't recognized. It wasn't a thing. Nobody knew what that was. So you didn't have it. Although you did. But your symptoms manifest itself in weird ways, like alcoholism or this or that. My dad was not an alcoholic, but he was emotionally shut down. And then my mom, who lost their first child as soon as Dad came back from war, it was tragic. It was hospital mistake. But back then you didn't sue. You just got on with your lives. You had other kids to raise. So, of course, what they did was, they had a jolly old life. But what they were really doing was putting up a mask and hiding behind that. But very well and very happily. We had a great family, and I was always being told how much I was loved and all this kind of stuff, but I never felt that stuff. And so I spent a lot of my adult life confused, trying to figure out how I could get some love going, not sure what that meant, because I grew up in this fog of a sense of happiness, happy people that I was observing. But then I'd come to realize they're not so happy. And how can I figure out what this, crack this nut? I spent most of my early career, well, I made a lot of mistakes. When you don't have that sense of direction and nurturing, I'm on my own. I have to figure this out on my own. I have to start something, that's wrong, let's go over here, try this, and that doesn't work, do this. So I had failed marriages, failed relationships. This happened, that happened. It'd be like, my mom would say, well, maybe someday you'll be successful. It's like, yeah, maybe, What do you do when you don't have a sense of what you want to do? But the one thing I always did well was that I could tell a great story. And I really thought my parents were really truly funny. They were amusing and interesting to watch. So by the time I finally got some things sorted out, and I was back at college at age 25, after being married, and after I was spending a lot of time making beef roasts and stuff that normally, girls my age, 19-year-olds, don't go to the store to buy a roast and go home and make a roast because my husband needed meat. So I just sort of decided I wanted to go back to art school, because I remember high school art class, and I knew that something I needed to do had something to do with telling the stories of the things that I saw growing up. And my parents were extremely, incredibly inventive and funny and weird and interesting. And I realize now they were completely creatives, but they got boxed in that time, in that generation, into the roles they needed to play. He was a plumber, she was a stay-at-home mom / secretary. And so they did what they needed to do to raise a bunch of kids, considering that they never addressed the crippling emotional difficulties that they buried. So in college, I was telling my friends about my parents and all the funny stories, and they would be laughing their asses off at the stuff I was telling them. And then I got so good at telling stories that I actually got up on stage and started doing comedy and telling people stories about everything that was going on. And I figured out a way to deliver story material, to talk about things, how to work my pacing so that there was a big theater attachment to it. In other words, I had to get up, get a group, talk to a group, engage them, keep them going, tell my stories. Then I started doing art about the stories and the people and the weird situations. And then I'd have to stand there and explain my situations, explain the stories to people. And I thought, wait a minute, if I'm making art, it needs to be self-explanatory. I can't follow my paintings around all over the place and tell them, well, this is about the time that this or such happened. So then I thought, you know what, I need to figure out how to combine the talk part, the tell part with the show and tell. How am I going to tell my story? And yet I like doing visuals. I gotta combine these somehow. Now remember, I'm thinking this way before there was stand-up, before it was a thing, before women were really seriously out there in the career world. I was doing this when there was no guidepost, nobody to say, hey, come on, be a cartoonist. To be a cartoonist meant you'd either do something for the daily newspaper, you would do a strip, or you would do comic books. But I wasn't doing any of that. I was like talking about my parents or my ex. I'd love to grind those X's with my art. So this was not anything that had a precedent, right? All right, so I was free again to do whatever I wanted, because what I did was followed what I needed to do. First I figured it out by these little fits and starts, and I forged away. Then I figured out what I wanted to do was visually tell the stories of my family. That's what I've done for 35, almost 40 years. Anyway, in 1994, finally, my mom opened up about my sister that died. I was looking at a bunch of old pictures, and she said, stop looking at those old pictures all the time. I said, yeah, but this is Ann, your daughter. Oh, I don't. You know, our whole lives, it was like, and finally she just, I don't know, got with a prayer group or something. I went to visit her, and she was like, weepy, weepy all the time. I was like, what's going on? She said, and she started to tell me about what really happened. And when I heard it, I was outraged and sad. It was like, what? What? You've held this your whole life? Very, very hard to deal with. And so I did a little research and took the pictures and thought of my mom, who had always been so guarded. And I made that into a story, which became a very powerful story people still talk about. It made the top 100 comics of the 20th century, this one story I did. And that kind of was my claim to fame. That got me started. I've told lots of stories, but this one had this emotional twist to it that people today, I met somebody last week that said, oh, anytime I get a chance, I show people a Hannah story. Well, in about 10 years later, 2004-ish, maybe around that time, no, around the turn of the millennium, I got the same situation. My mom had a stroke, and then my dad called me up one day and said, rivers of blood, and I was like, what? What are you saying? Well, he had cracked open the little portal to talking about what happened to him during World War II. And I was shocked, because why was he telling me? I mean, I was like nobody. Hey, Lint, I'm Lint over here, I'm nobody. How come all of a sudden you're talking to me? So, I just wrote everything down he said. He couldn't talk to Mom anymore, his best bud, because she'd had a stroke. And even though she could talk, it was about the bank balance, or if there needed to be milk bought, or maybe she'd like a cup of coffee. She'd lost her emotional sparkle, we call it. She lost her sparkle. So, at the same time, Dad started opening up about World War II, which to me was fascinating because I love history and I was always, like I said, talking about my family. This happened at the same time that in my personal life, another roadblock, my husband left. I had a teenager. A teenager who was very unhappy with what happened between her dad and me. A teenager who had to go to Children's Hospital to the psych unit all the time. So I spent a lot of time there with her, and then at home talking to her dad, trying to work things out. Trying to talk to my dad, who was finally talking, with the big story of his life, which was sort of an equivalent type Hannah story. So the only way I could sort it out was to do what I always do. Interpret it, write it down, tell stories, tell the story, tell the story. It took 10 years, but I did this book. This book called Soldier's Heart is about reaching, trying to reach and find the story, trying to pull out that emotional nut and see what that was about. You'll see on this box that I built, it's supposed to be upright, but I don't have it tied at the moment. But it says Charles W. Tyler and C. Tyler, 08. We made this box. This box contains all the artwork from the book. Every page was drawn by hand. Every page was 53 colors of ink I used. Every page in here took anywhere from 20 to 40 hours to do, and that includes if I had to correct it in Photoshop. Well, you guys have been having to watch this snowboarder the whole time? That's cool. So this entire, I can't get them out. I've got glass seaming stuff in between them. But what I have here on the top that I can show you are, sometimes I would draw the little cartoons from the stories. Like here's a scene where we're at Children's Hospital and my kid's in the bed. She was having visions. She wanted to harm herself. And the only way to make sense of it for a 12-year-old was to say that it was a horseman that was telling her what to do. This horse guy. It was him. The equestrian, she called him. He was telling her to jump and stuff. So we were very much on that. Because I wasn't going to lose my kid the way my mom had lost her kid. That's how I was able to fold the Hannah story back into the big story. Not only that, I didn't want to find myself in a repeat of what my parents went through. I didn't want to close my daughter off. I didn't want to lose touch with them. I wanted us to all talk. I wanted this to be open. I wanted everybody to be like, let's just work this thing out. I'm not going to be one of these intergenerational, continuing this trauma and stuff from World War II. Let's discuss. I wanted to get through to my dad. I wanted the wall to come down. Walls are bad. Anyway, for a while, these are not tracings. I liked the way it felt to draw on this stuff, on this, I got this at the thrift store, really good old-timey tracing paper. So I would have to transfer that to page. I thought, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to spend my whole, this will be labor intensive to be sure. I'm not going to be drawing and then having to transfer all these drawings. So I just kind of got rid of this after a while and started to draw directly on the paper. So these are all the some of the preliminary sketches from Soldier's Heart. All right, I'll show you this. So this was a bunch of toxic materials that Dad had. At a certain point in the story, they're moving, and I have to get rid of all the toxic materials he's collected over the years, and I'll show you where that is in the book in a little bit. And like, this is something I was at somewhere. I was like, wait a minute, I just thought I gotta draw this real quick. In France, after the war, women who were in collusion with the enemy, the townspeople would shave their heads and make them walk shamefully through the town, and they'd be jeered at because they had sided with the enemy. So this is a sketch that ended up being in the book, and so on. But eventually, I just quit that transferring. I didn't want to do that transfer stuff. There's a stack of those. What I wanted to do was just get to work. So I did. And like, here's a page where, see, I'm telling Hitler, who is simultaneously sometimes Hitler and sometimes this horrible black predator bird. I do a lot of animal personification in the book, symbols. And this leads to the point where I tell him off, you may not mess with my child. Because at the beginning in the book, the premise is, he says to me, you know, I messed with your dad so I could get to you, and you're a kid, right? In other words, war doesn't stop with the soldier. War hits civilians, war hits the families of civilians, and so on. So I have this confrontation piece, and I'm protecting her. And this page here. Yeah, thank you for passing that. Yes. And let's see. Look at these. Yeah. I did the book in 3 different sections because it was too big, almost too hot to handle. And I had, at the same time I'm doing this, my parents were old and sick, and I had to go take care of them. So I was doing these drawings in nursing homes and, every place, taking them with me, grabbing my portfolio, taking stuff with me. But this is the beginning of one of the things, one of the segments where I'm walking into this kind of like dreamscape. And these are the 5 main characters of the book. This is my daughter, get ready to jump. This is me with this coat on. The coat it is the actual inside liner. The only thing left of my dad's army stuff that he wore was the liner to his M1 jacket. And I found it some time ago, and I turned it into like a hippie peacenik jacket. And I had this X on the back with these tulips. I don't know why I did that. But throughout the book, I'm wearing the jacket. I'm adding more and more military patches as I learn about Dad's service. And then it turns out, as an old guy, he's wearing these suspenders. And so he's got an X on his back, and I got an X on my back. And we end up being the 2 main characters who are at odds with each other. You can see in this, well, it's not in here, but you can't see the X, but there he is at the front here. Dad. And then Mom, I have her, there's my husband, he's guilty, and feeling bad. And then my mom, I show her as a manatee, because after her stroke, she moved so slowly, and you had to have a walker. And I put a little orange wig on her head. Because she had red hair. That was her kind of her signature thing, was her beautiful curly red hair, wavy hair. And so all through when I talk about her as older, more a gentle state, I have her as a manatee with a walker and her wig. She never wore a wig, but the manatee wears a wig. Anyway, and then, there's a part here where when Dad and I get to Washington, D.C. Have you ever been to the World War II Memorial? Mm-hmm. I do this by hand. And what I did was, you know how when you go into these turrets in Atlantic and Pacific, these elements are inside the turrets, but that moment when you step into that space, I wanted to pull out those elements and make it look like it was just, because in our minds it was like just so incredibly amazing. I didn't know how else to depict the grandeur of the space and what it meant, especially for a veteran. So all the book pages are here. I can't really, what time is it? How much time do we have?
I
Oh, there.
think we go all the way up to the hour. Is that right? Yeah, that's right, because this is right before break. Yeah, so you have still like over 20 minutes.
So what I had going concurrently was the story of dealing with dad and mom as old people and what that meant. Then I had the story of dealing with my child and my husband, trying to put my family back together and all the difficulties I had there. Another story that was running was looking back at mom and dad as young people. Dad's war service. Mom as a young mother. And the damage that that did to them. And trying to fish that in and make it fit with why they were in the situation they were today. So I had lots of different ways I had to determine that. So for example, I did this part here where, okay, Dad told me about his war service. So that was his voice, and I had to figure out how to come up with a way to tell his army story. And so I kind of came up with this, his voice on the left, a little sketch on the right, and I had them in this format, so I would have to illustrate basically some part of what he was trying to say. And in the book, you know, it's dated 1941. So like I said, these things went through
Thanks for holding them up for me.
see, here's my 5 main characters, and I showed you later in the book. And then, you know, anytime Dad was telling his story, what is known for military people as their tour of duty. See, it's this. I made it have those old file folder. I wanted this to look like old 1940s office supply stuff. So that's why I kind of gave it this tone paper. All these colors came from old stuff from Scherzer. They just closed downtown, the old office supply place. I went down there and I was like, oh yes, I love all this stuff. I go to thrift stores and find the paper and stuff. Anyway, throughout the book is his tour of duty. This part here happens to be Italy, when he was in Italy. This part here is about being in France. This part here is about Rhineland, which was the Battle of the Bulge. And then this part back here is about his efforts to try to get home after the war, which was just as hard as, it's awful, what he had to go through. And then throughout the book, there are places where sometimes this is like a fictitious conversation of our emotional lives. There are places where here's a conversation in, you know, real conversation with mom and dad. There's mom, dad, I've got him as either a shark or a little fox because he was so difficult. Trying to talk to him, you know, I kept having to figure out ways to get the information across. This is a page where I'm discussing my concerns for them. They're in bed sleeping, a couple old people on there. My family's at home. It's, by the way, a 4-hour drive across the state of Indiana to take care of them. These are all my concerns, you know. What does he mean by that? I don't think they're eating right. How come there's mice in the cabinet? I need to quit thinking about my parents and take care of my own family. So this was apparently a sleepless night. You can see that it's kind of been a starry night thing. I'm looking outside, trying to get to sleep. This is me trying to sleep, trying to romance the sheep so I can sleep. Anyway, like I said, it took 10 years. My parents got to see part of the book. I told you I drew it all with a pen and a brush, just one pen and one brush.
Can we ask some questions?
Yes.
Did you make any sketches with like did you draw with pencil before the pen, or did you just go right in with ink?
I drew with pencil. I got some in my coat over there. This is a 2. I use a 1,
Okay.
and I just use a pencil.
Yeah.
That's a one, what is the difference between one and
One
two?
softer.
Softer, thank you, I didn't know that.
I have to have it soft.
Yes,
I
okay.
don't like mechanical pencils.
Is that book still available?
Oh, yeah, yeah, you can get it on, at places, you know, where you get stuff like that. What else can I tell you?
Adius has a question.
Here's a
Uh,
question here.
What paint do you use?
Ink. I
Like-
custom mix, that's ink.
Okay.
What-
I know it looks like paint, it sort of looks like paint, but it ain't paint. I had to put, on this one, I had a lot of technical problems with this one, because the paper kept kind of getting soaking in. So I think I coated this with matte medium or something, and I regretted it the minute I did it. Because I couldn't get the paint or the raindrop things to work. And let's see how it looks in the book too. Here it is.
So it's all liquid ink, like
Ink.
like
ink.
India black ink, but
Yeah,
then
India black ink.
colored.
And then Higgins.
Okay, Higgins.
You See
Okay.
the difference when the problem with printing, it took away so much, especially when
Yeah.
this first came out in 3 volumes.
Did you like Photoshop it to like try to fix that?
Well, I had to do that on every page, needed a little something. I'd have to take every page, get it situated.
Mhm.
Here's some. Oh, wait, and we're gonna watch this little video too, with the art show I had with it.
Oh yeah.
So like this page here, we'll just take this for example. Okay, I'm with this Marine I met a Marine. He was helping me with Dad, but we also had a little romance, woohoo. And so, he's the only place in the book that I use purple. Anything involving the Marine was purple. And I had to do this throughout the book. I had to assign specific colors and specific symbols and things like that so people would stay with me. So that is here. Let's see how that printed up. Here's this page. Let's see. It's just a little different, quite a bit smaller.
Definitely smaller, and it isn't as sharp
Yeah.
lines.
Yeah. That's because they had the type of paper stock. I mean, this book sells for $40.
Mhm.
To do it, to make it look like the art, it would almost be cost prohibitive.
Mhm.
To have like a 364-page book look exactly like the artwork. So I had to sacrifice some, but this is 10 times better. The first set, I think like this much. Yeah, this was the end of, remember I told you about that Hitler birds and all that stuff, the terrible Hitler. That terrible Hitler man, it ended here. Book 1 ended here. So there was actually this whole project originally was called You'll Never Know. And it came out in 3 separate volumes. So this was like the end, this was like the beginning of book 2. So this is in there somewhere. There's that horrible Hitler bird saying, your children, and yeah, I'm gonna hurt you to hurt your children, and it fills me with pride to do that. In other words, war causes harm beyond, it's just like you unleash chaos. You don't have just one person takes on another person, job settled, done. It's just total chaos.
Could I-
Anyway, I'll pass the book around, and maybe if you have a few other questions, we can talk about that. I do have 2 other projects going. I do want to show the video. I have this book coming out, there's a book out right now called Fab Four Mania, and it's from the same thing. When I was 13, I kept a diary about seeing the Beatles. The nuns told me, if you care about anything, you need to write it down and keep a record of it. So this little girl did. I wrote down everything I remembered about being excited about them, getting ready to go to the concert, going to the concert. And that's the book that just got on the Forbes and the Billboard thing. So very popular. Beatlemaniacs love it, and music people like it, and it's just. The other thing is, I have 2 other books in the pipeline. The one that'll be out like maybe the fall 2020 is a book called Tomatoes. Because during the end of this part of doing Soldier's Heart and really working with my parents as they were in their decline, I got a gig for Cincinnati Magazine. I got to do the inside back page for 3 years. Anything I wanted. So I focused on my street, Belvedere Avenue, which is over by the zoo, and my house, my community. It's primarily African American street. And so I told all kinds of funny stories. I had to keep it light because Cincinnati Magazine, I knew people would be in the waiting room waiting to get their tooth fixed or get their leg looked at or something like that. They'd want to look at read something light. They'd go through quickly. But it turns out our street is being demolished and taken over by the zoo. So this little street that I've been doing these stories about, that I've lived at for 20 years, will soon be even more. There'll be no more. It's gone. So I have a great local person, Kathy Y. Wilson. She's going to write the intro. It's a book about race. It's a book about the community and the loss of that, specific to Cincinnati. That book, Tomatoes, will be out 2020. And then the last thing will probably take me to my grave. I have this gigantic work I'm doing now, which is on the scale of this. Hope it's not this big. I'm running out of years, but it's about what happened to all these people.
Oh,
Because
wow.
while I was doing this book, let me just say, this book came out, Soldier's Heart. 3 volumes came out in 2009, 2010, and 2012. This book came out in 2015. I still have a lot to do in between, I've worked on it for 10 years. My dad died in May 2015. We had to take him up to Chicago and bury him at All Saints. Took all day. Came back on a Wednesday night to Cincinnati because I had driven to Indiana, over there on the other side of Indianapolis, and then up to Chicago and back. Got in the house. Yeah, we need a picture of your dad for the cover of the book by Friday. So I had to just put him in the ground. I had to draw his picture. So that's what I do. I tell stories about my family. I work under sometimes excruciatingly painful conditions. I work with very humble materials. I do everything by hand. And I never miss a deadline.
Wow.
I just lost a tooth, so excuse me.
Could I ask
Anyway, let's show that video.
would I be able to ask a question? I don't know if we have enough time, but okay. It's about how you learn to do what you do, because I think that a lot of students that I teach have stories they want to tell, whether they're memories or they're made-up stories. And I make them draw stuff from life as much as possible. And so I'm wondering,